OODAcast, informing your decisions with intelligence, analysis, and insight. Brought to you by the team at OODAloop.com.
Hello, I'm Bob Gourley, the Chief Technology Officer with OODA LLC, and today on the OODAcast, Trevor Hilligoss with SpyCloud. Trevor, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bob.
I can't wait to get into this conversation, and I really want to talk about SpyCloud, but before getting there, I wanted to talk a bit about you and your career arc because I find that fascinating too. So, can you walk us through how you got to where you're at now?
Yeah, happy to go into it. It's a bit of a bumbling journey, but I guess start with the army would be a logical place to start. So I joined the army out
Well,
of
why did you do
college.
that, Trevor?
That's oh man, you sound like my parents back then. Yeah, why did I do that? Well, I think I like a lot of college kids. I have kids that are a little too young to experience this just yet, but I imagine this is still the case today. You get to college, you have all these big ideas and big plans, and then you realize there's this thing called the real world that might not align with all of those big ideas and big plans. So you got to kind of figure out how to land on your feet. So my family has a history of service. My grandfather was in the Navy. So I think it was a combination of, wanting to serve my country and also realizing that joining the army would give me some purpose where being a barista, nothing against baristas, but serving coffee or sandwiches probably would not give me that same fulfillment. So, yeah.
Trevor, you did not join the Army with cyber in mind, did you?
No, no, not at all. My journey to cyber was not a straight line by any means. So my first 4 or 5 years in the army actually had nothing to do with cyber. I was a forward observer, providing direction for artillery and mortars and aviation. So yeah, my journey to cyber really came after I kind of decided that law enforcement was my next step. And that was still within the Army, within the Army's Criminal Investigations Division. But yeah, certainly not the biography that you see typically in concert with a cyber career. No.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of us actually went through that. I was in the Navy as an intelligence officer, and I'll never forget in the Pentagon hearing about this exercise eligible receiver. And my response to the person who was telling me that NSA was able to get from the internet into SIPRNet and prove they could manipulate blood databases was that's very important. I'm glad somebody else is handling that. And next thing you know, I get pulled into that world. And
Right. Yeah, that sounds complicated. I'm glad I'm not involved. Oh, wait.
yeah, yeah. So from the Army, you transitioned to law enforcement. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Kind of came to the realization that being good at identifying a point on a map to make no longer exist doesn't have a whole lot of career opportunities beyond the army. So I always had this idea. It's kind of silly to say this now, but I always wanted to go join the FBI. That was like kind of my aspirational goal as a kid. And so I remember I met with a mentor of mine who actually had retired from the FBI, and he said, "Look, the best thing you can do is just start working your way there, and eventually you'll kind of make it." And the first step for that was Army CID, which is, if you're not familiar, Navy NCIS would be the comparable service there in the Navy, but basically the federal law enforcement for the Army, doing everything from somebody steals an M4 rifle to violent crime to cyber, which is where I went.
Right. And then from there, you participated with the FBI in their joint ransomware task force.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I left the Army, went to a civilian job still with the Department of the Army, still as a special agent, just in a civilian non-uniform capacity. And then I had the opportunity to join an FBI cyber task force in Austin. Um, Funnily enough, actually, my choices were Pittsburgh. I could either go to the NCFTA in Pittsburgh, or I could go to the cyber task force in Austin. And I remember I was in a hotel room with my wife about to leave uniform service, and I led with Pittsburgh. And then as soon as I said Austin, my wife immediately said, "Okay, we're done talking. I think we know. I think we know where we're going to go next." So yeah, so Austin won us over in a heartbeat there.
Good move for sure. Because not
Yeah.
only do you serve the mission there, of course, but what a great environment. It's a great innovation ecosystem there.
Yeah, it really is. It's cool. We had Army Futures is there, so there's a huge defense component there. Very cutting edge research facilities. You've got University of Texas there, Texas A&M, which has an amazing engineering program. So yeah, it really is. I'm not going to sit here and say it's the new Silicon Valley or whatever that seems to be the way to describe it these days, but it definitely does have a cool vibe that reminds me of sort of that startup mentality, but with a healthy amount of Texas charm.
Cool. And so from here, can you tell me the foundational story of SpyCloud?
Yeah, so I was first introduced to SpyCloud while I was working at the FBI. SpyCloud was founded in Austin in 2016. Um, Obviously, quite a bit of uh, shared mission space, I guess, with the law enforcement, especially by virtue of being having access to vast amounts of data. Things like attribution can be made much easier. So that was my introduction to SpyCloud, actually through a case that just finished up yesterday, as of at least as we're recording this. The Raccoon Info Stealer case, the developer was just sentenced yesterday. So that was my first intro. And then when I was kind of thinking about my career after the government, I really wanted to go someplace that certainly shared my values and where I could still, have a positive impact. And SpyCloud was the natural choice there. So left the FBI in 2022, and well, can't say I've never looked back because I still like those guys, but certainly glad to be where I am.
Cool. That's great. Yeah, I've seen SpyCloud, been treated to some great demos. And I think, like a lot of people, when I first saw the demo, it's like, okay, this is unique. But can you give me your description of SpyCloud? What do you guys do? What's your unique specialty?
Yeah. So um, we we really focus on um, gathering information that the criminals know about you. Is I guess the one-liner. The organization that I run within SpyCloud is called SpyCloud Labs. So we're the research entity within the broader SpyCloud. And what we do is sit in the places where the criminals sit. We target the private groups, the invite-only channels, the forums you can't pay to get into. We monitor those ones too, of course. But we really want to go after the closest we can get to where the cyber criminals are and where that data is being shared. And then we collect that data. We have a lot of really cool internal tooling that we've built to process that data at scale, to be able to represent that in a way that's searchable. And then we make it available. And there's a lot of use cases there. There's a defensive use case that's righteous, plucks my heartstrings. If we can identify what the criminals know before they're able to use it, that means we might be able to get in front of them, which is fantastic. It's always good to beat them. And then there's the other side of it, which is my intro to SpyCloud, the attribution level. Bad guys on the internet like to operate with anonymity as their shield. And especially, my career, a lot of the guys I focused on were in Russia or countries around Russia where their postal service does not like accepting silver bracelets from the FBI. So you gotta kind of get creative to figure out who they are and be able to enforce some consequences on them. So being able to have access to that level of data goes going back decades sometimes, can be immensely powerful in unmasking some of these people that are doing bad things on the internet.
And there's places in the world where it seems like the rule of law just doesn't exist. where Western democracies cannot enforce the law, or it's extremely hard. There's other places where the rule of law can be enforced, and it seems like SpyCloud is able to pull together information, find attribution, get that to law enforcement, and help deter crime that way.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Bob. I mean, I think one of my biggest takeaways from 2024 actually is there's kind of this interesting arc that I've observed. Coming from when I first came over to law enforcement, cyber law enforcement was seen as basically analogous to any other kind of law enforcement, right? In terms of like how you're rated, how you're graded, your success is determined. It was all about indictments, prosecutions, convictions, right? Unfortunately, as you noted, a lot of these guys operate with impunity because they're in countries that either don't care or they don't prey upon their own citizens. So why would Russia want to go after somebody that's aligned with their aims? So contrast that with now, certainly 2024, but it's been happening for a few years at least. There's a lot more emphasis on disruption. And disruption does not always mean that somebody gets those silver bracelets, right? And an extended stay in a cold prison. Sometimes it means they're just unable to function, or it's more difficult for them to function. We saw this with Lockbit, with the Lockbit administrator, where they threw up his picture on all these blog sites and basically removed the anonymity that was his protection. We saw this again with Operation Magnus, which is the takedown of Redline and Meta, right? Huge disruptions like that. Doesn't really matter where the people are geographically residing. If we can target the infrastructure and make their lives very difficult, we can do that at scale, and we can have an outsized impact.
Great. Yeah. And now for enterprises, let's say, Fortune 500, big kind of enterprise, they can tap into your data and get some forewarning at times, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So the defensive side is one that's really close to my heart. That the I'll get really nerdy here for a second, but if you remember a scene in The Hobbit where the dragon Smog is torching Lake Town, and there's it's got all these scales, and there's one scale that's missing, and that's the scale. You have to be able to target that tiny little spot to be able to, with a black arrow, to be able to take him down, right? That's a really good metaphor for how businesses in today's day and age, cyber age, have to operate, right? You can have all of this, millions of dollars in monitoring and detection response, and one single scale missing is all the criminals need to be able to take you down, right? So it's not really a matter of if, unfortunately, it's a matter of when. And if that's true, which I believe it is, all we can do is well, not all we can do. Certainly, we want to do the good thing. We want to make sure it's as hard as possible. We want to limit the amount of missing scales to the extent we can. But knowing that we're not going to be able to be 100%, that's just not possible, then visibility is your only option, right? Being aware of what the criminal knows before they're able to use it. And that might be a set of credentials that they're in the possession of. Maybe it's a valid authentication cookie or an API token that hasn't been revoked. The amount of things is quite vast, but if you can be aware of those, if you can know what assets of yours that are critical to your environment are in the possession of the criminals, you can take action against those assets. So you can't limit the amount of information that the criminals necessarily have access to, at least at that stage, right? They've already got it, but we can make it useless. And that is really, really critical.
And so some of this sounds like it could be very tactical things like they've identified all the routers you use internally. They know the maker, the model, and they've identified that 12 of these still have default passwords, that kind of thing, right? So then the defenders can go in and say, well, change those.
Totally. Yeah. And it's kind of funny you bring that up because it really is, we in cybersecurity, and I'll raise my hand and admit to this as well. I think we have a tendency of hyper fixating on sophistication, right? If you read, research reports on actors, like Control F for sophistication, I guarantee it's in the first sentence, right? Sophistication doesn't matter as much as we think it does. It used to, certainly, right? But today, and this has been the case for some time, I would argue. Um, when you look at this, the choice between buy versus build, right? Do I need to build this attack chain? Do I need to build this kind of boutique malware or vulnerability exploit, whatever? Or can I just go buy it from somebody else? There's really, I mean, accepting the APTs, obviously, but if we're talking about cyber criminals, there's not a whole lot of reason that you would take the time to build it yourself today, right? There's just so many options to buy it. And when that's true, what that effectively means is you're turning crime into a commodity and you're making it accessible to very low levels, right? You don't need to be some, hardcore hacker with green matrix terminal font, right? To be able to figure out how to, chain some things together and make a successful attack. It costs a couple $100 in Bitcoin, and somebody else has already written the code for you, right? So, the only reason I bring that up is I think we're really, really focused on the hard stuff when oftentimes what ends up punching us in the mouth are the really easy things we overlook.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and it resonates with me. It really does. And now, any major player that gets attacked, if you're a publicly traded corporation, you have to notify all your shareholders and the SEC. And sure enough, the first line is going to be, "We were hit by a sophisticated, advanced, persistent threat using 0 days." Really? Really?
Yeah, it's funny. We by virtue of who we are and what we do, we get to talk to a lot of threat actors, and I will tell you the overwhelming majority of them are young, late teens, early 20s, and not who you would think of in terms of sophisticated actors. One of the guys I remember. I say guy, I mean, I don't know who this person is, but could not figure out how to get ChatGPT to write Python to correctly apply his watermark to the data that he was trying to share. He wanted to get his Telegram username in there, but the code that ChatGPT was generating for him was overwriting data, and he was just so frustrated. It's like, man, the level of expertise here is just as low as you could possibly get without being in the floor, right?
Yeah. And still, this is extremely serious because that guy's could buy access, buy a tool, get it placed in
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah, that guy actually, that individual was part of a Trafford team. So a Trafford team basically is a group of criminals that come together, pool resources to essentially get access to more tooling and to, attack at scale and share the proceeds. But we attributed hundreds of thousands of infections to this group that this person's a part of. So yeah, I mean, like it's just wild. You would not look at that kind of a person like you're having trouble having ChatGPT generate your Python to modify a text file, like and you're also partly responsible for hundreds of thousands of victimization. How do we square those two things, right? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, Trevor, I want to keep talking about the prevention, of course, that is so critically important. But what does SpyCloud have capabilities after breach, after infection, in helping to remediate and return to a known good state?
Yeah, so this is something we refer to as post-infection remediation or PIR. So everybody has, infection or an incident response runbooks, playbooks that we all follow. Some organizations might be sophisticated enough to have specific runbooks based on what type of threat is this ransomware, is this a spillage, is this a successful phish, whatever the case may be. What is difficult is getting people to understand that it's not just what happens on your network that's important, right? We can all quarantine, we can all do digital forensics, incident response. Like there are good established tactics and procedures for all of those things. Unfortunately, if you're not paying attention to what's already been stolen, then there's a lot of visibility that's being missed. So take, for example, info stealers are kind of the buzzword of the year. I'm seeing a whole bunch of info stealers that are preceding things like ransomware and other really serious events, even nation state attacks. Info stealers by virtue are quite simple, right? I mean, they give it away in the name. They're malware that steals information. So if all I do is quarantine that device, lock it down, reset it to a known good state, I haven't really remediated anything, right? I've remediated the individual threat. I've remediated the access to that individual host, but everything that was stolen is still out there. The internet is forever, right? There's no undo button for malware. So if you don't have visibility into all of that, and it might be the autofill information that contains secrets, it might be API tokens that are still valid, it might be cookies that have valid TTLs, it might be credential. Like the list is endless, the amount of data that can be stolen. So if you don't know what all of those assets are that are in the hands of the criminals, then every single one of those is still a risk to you, right? It doesn't matter how many times you reformat that hard drive. The data is still out there and it's still valid. And the criminals know this. There's a lot of effort in the criminal ecosystem to use this data to gain initial access and sell that access on, especially to ransomware actors and affiliates. So there is this large, I would say, gap in knowledge between the things that we can do at the forensic level and what we can really do to remediate the full exposure, including the information that was stolen.
Right. And so it starts with that knowledge of here's what was
Absolutely.
stolen, here's the technical details, and now you've got to do this to really and truly remediate.
Yeah, yeah. It's like ignorance is not bliss, right? It's just not. It might be bliss for a few days, but guess what? The dreaded 4:30 p.m. Slack message on a Friday is going to come in, and that's going to be a crappy weekend, right?
All right, let me kind of switch subjects because you mentioned cookies, and I want to get your views on session hijacking. And how do we explain what session hijacking is to the busy executive and why that may be a threat?
Yeah. Oh, fantastic question. So session hijacking is, well, let me do a little bit of background here. So I think it's important to kind of understand what cookies are. So in web development, there's this balance between user experience and security, and it does seem like something of a zero-sum game, right? If you're going to take from one, you kind of have to, or if you're going to give to one, you kind of have to take from another. So what cookies do is basically, if you imagine, your authentication workflow for your bank account, go to the portal, you sign in, you click on checking, you go back, right? You don't have to sign in again. Your browser knows that you're already authenticated. It communicates that by way of a cookie to the server and says you're good to go. Sometimes it'll reissue you another cookie, so it'll give you that, it'll extend that validity period. But at some point, that cookie becomes invalid. And then we've all done this, right? We leave a tab open on our browser, we go back the next day, we click refresh, and it puts us back at the login portal. That's great. That's what it's supposed to do. Unfortunately, the period of validity of those cookies is really, really, really critical. And we've gotten really good in some sectors. Finance is actually one that's gotten very good at this, making very short cookies, and less good in other places. Email is always the worst, just universally the worst, right? And again, it goes back to that user experience side. I don't want to have to re-enter my credentials every time I refresh my Gmail box, right? I want to be able to refresh it and get that two-factor authentication code that just got emailed to me without having to go through steps. Unfortunately, what that means is if a criminal has access to that cookie, they can pass that cookie off as you, and there's no authentication at all, right? It's functionally identical to if you had just clicked that refresh button on your own browser or clicked your savings account instead of your checking account. So what session hijacking is, the hijacking part is the important there, right? We're not talking about authentication bypass. Authentication happened. Valid authentication exists, right? They are hijacking a valid session without consent.
Yeah, and the worst case here, a worst case would be if I'm a large company and I give access to my employees to just hundreds of applications because they've logged in, then the adversary gets that access to these hundreds of applications.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And SSO is a huge target here, right? There's a lot of reasons why single sign-on is great. Certainly for the UX part, it's fantastic. I love being able to just click through and access all these services, and it just does a little loading screen and I'm there. Unfortunately, if a criminal is able to access that same SSO vault, they're going to do the exact same authentication workflows. This is actually made even worse by oftentimes a lot of those SSO. The implementation of that is that every time you use that SSO to authenticate into a new service, that cookie is reissued. So even if we have a very short timeout on that cookie, if a criminal is able to sneak in before the end of that and authenticate through another service that SSO is connected to, depending on how that's configured, it could actually either regenerate a cookie or extend that cookie's TTL so that it's valid much longer, which enables the criminal to move laterally, essentially wherever that SSO has access.
Yeah, then there's a couple ways that the bad guys could get those cookies and get that session, right? They could have malware on an endpoint, on a box, or they could set up a look-alike website that deceives an employee or a customer and then rapidly capture it there and take over the session.
Yep. Yeah. So that the latter example you shared is happening a lot. There's a lot of phishing sites that are doing this, basically forcing the browser to drop a valid cookie, and then we see a lot of interestingly connections to Telegram, where basically a message will be posted to a channel, and that enables very quick access so that they can load that cookie into a browser. There's browsers that are created for this purpose. They oftentimes will advertise themselves as, anonymous browsers, which I just love. It's fantastic branding, great marketing strategy there. But really, it just enables the criminal to, import a profile, look like a valid user. Residential proxies have a part in this. I mean, this is all really it's a complicated, but it's very decentralized ecosystem kind of supporting this workflow.
Yeah, and it seems like both governments and companies and nonprofits should all be concerned about this. And what is SpyCloud's role in helping to mitigate that threat?
Yeah, yeah, I think everybody should be concerned about it. It's very pervasive. The criminals have gotten very good at this, and again, going back to the sophistication discussion, doesn't take a lot to figure this out, right? This is not a hard problem for the criminals to solve. What SpyCloud does, we collect this data. We collect hundreds of thousands of infostealer infections every single day. Those infections contain all kinds of data points. I went through them earlier, everything from API tokens to credit card information to cookies. So we parse all that out and then we deliver that so that we could hopefully reset those cookies. Because the thing about cookies, the workflow is slightly different, right? If you talk about a credential, a username or an email address and a password, I'm going to have to do a password reset, right? Either me as the employee or maybe me as the company. I can do that remotely. I can request a password reset. For cookies, the only thing you can do is invalidate that cookie, right? Because as long as that cookie is still valid, it's still, it is basically in itself the entire authentication package, to say it one way, right? So the quicker you can go and invalidate that cookie, the faster you're protected from that attack. You obviously still need to remediate the infection where that cookie was taken from. Hopefully that happens alongside, but at a minimum, if we can invalidate that cookie very quickly, we're shutting down that avenue of access.
Right. Trevor, I want to switch topics again just because there's so many things I want to talk to you about, if that's okay.
Sure.
And this kind of pisses me off a lot, and that's fraud. Now, fraud's a big topic. Maybe we should bend it into a couple chunks here. There's fraud against companies where people are deceived into sending money the wrong place or are tricked through a business email compromise or some other bad actor manipulates them and gets data. Can we talk about that one first? And does SpyCloud have capabilities here that may help?
Yeah. So there's a lot of these scams. BEC one you mentioned is super pervasive. We've seen a lot of pig butchering scams happening. These are where there's generally a fraudulent crypto investment that is offered, and then there's essentially a confidence scheme to get somebody to put their money someplace where they'll never have access to it again. These are really pervasive scams, and they're really they piss me off too because of who they target, right? The victimology of this tends to be disproportionately elderly people that probably aren't as familiar as you and I with computers. Maybe they didn't grow up with computers or haven't used them very much. They might trust somebody because they use big technical terms that sound right to them. Think about like the IT scams. And the amount of loss is really staggering. It's not uncommon at all to hear about somebody that's lost their entire life savings. Their entire retirement account went to a scammer in Cambodia or Vietnam or China or one of these places. So it's really damaging. A lot of the targeting comes from data that's available through breaches and malware, right? If you kind of think about the actor methodology side of this, the actors are having to find this information somewhere, right? They're not. It's not really a willy-nilly like just guessing game of calling U.S. phone numbers and hoping that you hit somebody that's susceptible. That would be a waste of time, right? So a lot of these scammers are using a lot of the same data that groups like ransomware groups are using to identify good targets, right? We talk about ransomware actors using, like business intelligence leads services to identify how much a company makes. Well, there's an analogy there on the scam side where, they're looking at Facebook profiles and, leaked dating profile history and sure, malware infections to try to find the profile of person who they think is going to be most susceptible to these crimes. So, I certainly share your irritation here. This is one that
Yeah.
definitely works me up. I remember being duty agent and getting these calls and just like, I want to help you, but I can't. The money, unfortunately, crypto doesn't have an undo button either.
Yeah.
So once that money gets out, there's unfortunately very little that can be done to rake it back, other than going after the scammers. And I think that's where
Yeah.
we should focus our attention.
I think you're right. I really do. And I think that there's also things that the technical community, that our providers of infrastructure can do to improve their protection of our elderly, especially. So elderly in my family have been targeted in horrible, horrible ways. I was at a conference this summer put on by the AFCEA Intelligence Committee and INSA, the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. I was briefing in a room of about 900 people, and I asked everybody there, if you have an elderly relative that was the victim of a fraud, please raise your hand. And it was about 90% of the people. And I think the other 10% of the people just don't realize that their elderly relatives are being targeted because as part of the manipulation, they're told, don't tell anybody or you'll ruin it. And it's just really devastating, the amount of
Yeah,
crime here.
yeah, there's a stigma associated with it too. I mean, I on a personal note, while I was still a special agent, my grandfather-in-law, my wife's grandfather, had this happen and lost tens of thousands of dollars. And the only reason I even found out about it is because their children were basically monitoring they were quite old children were monitoring their accounts and were able they didn't they were ashamed. They didn't feel like they could tell this to somebody. You know, their their granddaughter's husband so working with a badge and a gun on every single day, and they couldn't tell me. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's really sad. It's sad that the people do this to each other, and it's sad that we haven't found a solution for it yet. Of all the things that we're really good at, I think we're letting a very vulnerable population down.
Yeah, well, one of the things we did in the OODA network is we pulled together a team of technologists who all have family that have been through this. And one of us, Ken Westbrook, formed a nonprofit, the Stop Scams Alliance, where his niche is let's work with the big infrastructure providers and see what they can do at their level to change the equation at least a little bit. And Ken's making some good progress, I think. He's got Google now has an alert system on Android devices. So this may be a scam when you get the call. But still, as a Army CID guy and former FBI guy, that the bad guys target this, the brain, and they get somebody to really want to participate in this scam. You're going to get your richest dreams rewarded. You'll find love. You won't be lonely anymore, or you'll get financial rewards, or you're going to look like a star in front of your family, and it's really horrible.
Yeah, it's social engineering. It's the oldest attack in the book. There's probably penetration testers listening to this right now that are shaking their heads. But yeah, it's oftentimes in any in any security setting, the weakest link is the human being,
Yeah.
right? We can write code to accept true false, and unless there's a vulnerability, it's hard to invalidate that. But human beings don't really work in binary.
Yeah, and
So
just
there's a
thinking through
risk there.
this, Trevor, like my family is not going to sign up for a SpyCloud service to protect our elderly from threats, but the banks, maybe they could tap into SpyCloud and get forewarning of threats to their customers, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And certainly a lot do. I'd also plug we run a website called checkyourexposure.com, spelled exactly like that, checkyourexposure.com. Any free email that you have, you can put in there, see how it's been exposed in our data. There's obviously you got to have access to the email. We don't want to contribute to the problem here. We also let you put in a password to see, is this a good password to use? But yeah, to your point, like, I mean, the enterprise side of this is really how we have to fix this. I think that, it's quite frankly, and this is not to deprecate any individual. It's just too complex for the individual,
Yeah.
right? We all lead lives. Not all of us are super nerdy in this segment, right? We are a small class that cares about this stuff. So the way that we can fix this problem, I would say, is really two ways. There's the enforcement angle. We need to make it cost to the criminals. We need to make this hurt, where there is certainty and celerity that if they do something wrong, there will be consequences. And then the other side of this is the blue team side. What can we do from an organizational perspective, based on our the vast amounts of data that we have access to, whether that's SpyCloud itself or a financial institution or social media institution, to be proactive, to try to detect these scams before they happen, or in the early stages, and provide enough barriers that it's going to disincentivize that victim from becoming a victim, right? And I think that is where you guys seem to be focused, and wholeheartedly support that.
Good, great. Let me switch topics again because another massive threat to our nation is the threat surface of small and mid-sized businesses. They're everywhere and they need help. And a lot of them, you can convince them to go to a managed service provider, and if you're lucky and they got budget, a managed service security provider. Is that a path for them to tap into SpyCloud?
Certainly can be. Yeah, absolutely. We partner with a lot of managed service providers, to be able to do protection. But you're absolutely right. It reminds me of a story. It's been years, but we doing response, doing duty response to threats. Came across a defense contractor, mom and pop shop, right? Son is the IT guy. Make one little widget, but happens to be a very critical widget. Well, they're supplying some multi-billion dollar company that's got all the bells and whistles, all the security solutions, whole teams of contractors that can come and help them remediate. But who's going to help this company, right? When SHTF, when there's a ransomware event, like in this case, who's going to come down and walk through restoring from backups, or even ask if there was backups, or who's going to be the negotiator for this? And the thing that really concerns me about that is, we are such a decentralized society in terms of how we approach supply chains. We kind of minimize the impact of those kind of small and medium businesses, where oftentimes their impact is much bigger than their actual organizational size, right? In that case, I mean, I don't know this, but what if that one little widget was the critical part to the F-35, right? And by taking this small manufacturer in Texas out of the equation, we're no longer able to produce F-35s. Not saying that was the case, but you can imagine a world where that becomes a national security incident, right? And I do think we can do a lot more on the defender side of this to protect those organizations.
Yeah, great, cool. Well, Trevor, I really appreciate all this, and I wanted to ask for some concluding thoughts and maybe some hopeful thoughts on the future. What makes you optimistic about the state of cybersecurity today?
Bob, I am very optimistic. I don't know if that makes me an oddity among my peers, but no, I think we've come a long way. The fight's not done by no means. I don't know that it ever will be, right? I think job security is pretty secure, being in cybersecurity. But we're certainly making it cost more to the adversaries, right? And what really brings a smile to my face is seeing press releases from law enforcement entities in the U.S. and Europe getting really creative, right? The name and shame campaigns, the cool little cartoon videos poking fun at these guys. Like, let's diminish them. Let's call them out. Let's make the emperor have no clothes. Let's make their lives harder. If we can put handcuffs on them and throw them in jail, fantastic. But if not, let's do everything we can to make their life hard. There's a hashtag that's been going around for a while. I'll rep it here. It's hashtag make bad people sad. I think we should endeavor to do that every day of our lives if we can. And I'm really heartened that it seems like the law enforcement community is absolutely in line with that now as well.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Make it hard on them. And I also like the name and shame and, don't build them up. They're cheating weasels. So let's call them that.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the 50-foot billboard in a small Russian town with a guy's face and address and crypto wallet net worth on it. We haven't gotten there yet, but we're heading in the right direction.
Well, Trevor, thanks for this today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bob. I really enjoyed this chat.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.